Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear subject. 1 Charlie Bravo, exited in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I'm great. Another week, another show. We the show's grown a lot, and we want to thank everybody out there that listens to the show. We are back to another Checkride episode. This is something we put together that we're branding or calling Checkride Turbulence, taking the bumps out of Checkrides. And this week we want to talk about really something basic to help you prepare for the Checkride that Wally sees too few people doing, and that I unfortunately hear about some students that come to us from other flight schools that don't use these books on a regular basis. And as we become commercial pilots, we probably think of them a lot more, but as student pilots, you should have and be aware of 3 big things as it relates to flying. There's obviously more, but these are 3 things for the Checkride: the POH, the ACS, and the FAR AIM. And if you were to bring those 3 books to your Checkride and actually know how to use them and know what's in them, I think you'd be surprised how easy that Checkride day would go. Would you agree, Wally?
Absolutely. I remember my first, I grew up in an aviation family. I flew with my father quite a bit as a very young little boy. But I took my first, what I call my first real flying lesson on August 31st, 1981, so almost 40 years ago. And it was in a Tomahawk, Piper Tomahawk. It was 2549 Alpha. And I remember walking the first flight. We flew for about an hour, and we walked back into the flight school, the FBO. And I remember my instructor taking me right up to the counter, and there was a little display case there. And he said, you need to get that book right there, and you need to learn it. Now, I had already done the private pilot ground school, so I already had a copy of the FARAIM, and I had a Jeppesen private pilot book, and so I was well on my way. But I remember him saying, okay, you need to buy that book, and you need to know everything in it. And so that night, I remember going home and opening up the POH and starting to remember it, to memorize it and learn it. And, I remember learning the propeller manufacturer. It was a 78-inch propeller, fixed pitch. And I'm thinking to myself, well, okay, he said I needed to learn it, so
Did you know what that meant on that day? Did you instantly know what all that meant?
Probably not.
Right.
Probably not, but I did. I learned it. And nowadays, I went back and I think of my career, my aviation career, and how many check rides I've taken over my career, and I don't know how many it is, but it's a lot. And I don't think I have ever taken a check ride in an airplane that I did not have a personal copy of the POH, whether it be in print or digitally. I went to my bookshelf the other day and I found that Tomahawk manual. I still have it. It's over 40 years old. I have a Beechcraft Baron manual. I have a Beechcraft Duchess. I have a Bonanza manual. I have one for a Warrior. And they're old, but they're still good. The information in them is still valid. And of course, with the airlines, they issue you manuals. And back in the day, it used to be paper manuals, but now it's all digitally transmitted via iPad. So that makes it very nice. But again, I have never taken a check ride in an airplane that I did not own the manual to. And, so what do you study in the manual, the POH we're talking about here? So what do you study? Well, obviously limitations. It's more knowing knowing how to use the manual than knowing what's in it. And I tell people, man, if you were just going to spend 10 minutes getting an overview of the manual, maybe the table of contents for each chapter might be a good thing, just so you know what's in there.
Yeah, and we'll show some of my lack of pilotage when I was a student. and how I got smarter as I got more proficient, and it probably happens to everybody. But I fly our 182 a lot now. I fly it a lot with my family. I check the fuel, obviously, a lot, and I have a dipstick that tells me how much fuel's in that. And recently, I think I asked a ramper or somebody to check that for me before I went. And then I checked it again before I went, and the numbers weren't the same that I'd asked for, and I thought that was a little bit odd. But they went and did that with the dipstick, and they had the wrong dipstick, of course. But I asked them, I said, do you know in the POH where to look at how many gallons are in the tank? Because they had a dipstick that said a different number of gallons in that particular tank. And this is a student pilot who wants to learn, and I wanted to teach them and also teach my upfront staff as well at the same time. I said, where do we look? Let's go pull out the POH and look at it. And it was funny. They jumped towards the back and performance and the fuel system and all these other places. But as you talk about limitations, there's a pretty good summary right up in the 4th or 5th page that talks about what each tank has in it. And that's a quick way to verify. And to your point about knowing how to use the book, I don't necessarily need to know every plane and every tank size and everything at an airport. But if I'm going to go fly that plane, I better know where to find out how much fuel it can hold.
Exactly.
And then make sure I fill it to the right levels for the flight and the weight and balance that I'm looking for.
Exactly.
It's about using it, right?
Right. And I signed off a student for a CFI check ride a couple of years ago, and I just remember the examiner telling me that he was very happy with the student. He said, it was a female, he said, she doesn't know everything, but boy, she knows exactly where to go to get the information. And that's worth its weight in gold, knowing where to go to get the information.
No doubt. So the POH is very important. Lots of great information in there. I'm jealous when I hear people that get the book and they come back the next day and they said, I read the whole thing, because I can't sit down and do that sort of thing. I remember doing that for my multi-engine check ride and really understanding the airspeeds and really getting into creating cheat sheets for myself to have in the plane to use, because I became knowledgeable about the systems, of course.
Right.
But the things that I would need in real time were probably much fewer. So I did create my own Cliff Notes version of what was going to be important while flying that particular aircraft. But there's so much good stuff in there that everybody needs to know.
And reading the POH will help you learn the airplane better from the standpoint of the manual you're going to have is probably not going to be the POH for that particular airplane. So it's going to be one that you've found online or you've bought. And so some of the systems, for instance, you may have an airplane that has a 24-volt electrical system, and you might have a 24-volt battery. You may have two 12-volt batteries. You may have the 45-amp alternator. You may have the 65-amp alternator. So it creates questions for you that when you come back out to the flight school, you can say, hey, does this airplane have the 65-amp alternator, or does it have the 45? So it causes you to do some research, and which I think is very helpful.
For sure. So one that I know you're passionate about, I'm passionate about it. It's free on the internet for everybody to go download from the FAA's website. It's called the ACS. It stands for the Airman Certification Standards. Wally, are you ever on a check ride and have heard, or training someone and heard AC what?
Yeah. That's you can usually tell. I will actually before we even start the check ride, I tell them that the plan of action that I have created for this check ride was taken from the ACS. And sometimes I get a funny look in their eyes, and I say, are you familiar with the ACS? And a lot of times they'll say, well, yeah, my instructor pulled it out a couple times. And you know, I get a little nervous for the applicant when I hear that. The ACS, Airman Certification Standards, is the new, well, I shouldn't say new, it's a couple years old for private and instrument and commercial. It's basically the document that examiners create, or I shouldn't say create, use to create their Checkride scenario. It is free of charge from the FAA website. You can also if you're a ForeFlight user, you can go into the documents section and download it there. But there's so much good information in the ACS, and I am referencing it almost daily when I'm doing check rides. I may do a commercial check ride, then I'm doing a private, and I'm thinking, oh, gee, is it 100 feet or is it 200 feet? Well, I just pull it up and just confirm what the standards are. But the ACS, in the very front, there's an introduction section, and it talks about the Airman Certification Standards concept, using the ACS. And then you go in and you can go through the areas of operation of the ACS. The AOA 1, I'm just looking at a private ACS right here, is pre-flight preparation, and then 2 is pre-flight procedure. And 3 is airport and seaplane base operations. I'm not going to go through everything. But there are 3 sections to each AOA subsection. There's a knowledge, risk management, and skills elements. And basically, if you just go through there and read all of that, and as an examiner, we were required to cover all the skills elements. We were required to pick 1 risk management element and 1 knowledge element. And of course, as an applicant, you don't know what we're going to pick. So it's prudent to be familiar with all of them. But for instance, a lot of it for landings. Every landing, one of the elements is proper use of checklist. Well, it basically says you got to use the checklist. So the ACS, and in the back of the ACS, there's quite a bit of good reading material. Sometimes it can be a little dry. But, you don't have to read this whole document at one sitting. In fact, if you go into the instrument ACS, that's where you could actually find out what is required to do on a instrument proficiency check. You want to say, well, gee, I haven't flown or I haven't done any instrument work in over a year, so I'm going to have to do an IPC. Well, what's required on an IPC? Well, it's just in the back of the ACS. And it's spelled out for you. So again, something that really, it's the test. It's the test. I can remember going into a university class, the first day of class, and when the professor stands up there and says, "Hey, all the tests are going to come from this document," I'm thinking to myself, "Okay, I've picked a good professor for this chemistry class, or whatever class it is." The check rides are going to come from the ACS.
And that pretty much is the answer sheet, as you said. So go look at it. If you can meet those standards as it relates to maneuvers and can talk to all of the bullets and or maybe reference material that can help you find the answers to some of those questions, then I think you're going to be golden. And anybody who, I can remember, it was PTS when I took my private. What was PTS?
Practical test standards.
Practical test standards. So similar book. The FAA has made some changes to it. ACS is the new version and acronym, but there used to be special emphasis areas, and I can remember, I think we pulled out that book like the day before to review those special emphasis areas, and I was thinking to myself, all the weight of the check ride coming and being nervous, I was thinking, man, we should have looked at this a couple weeks ago,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're a student pilot at any stage working on private instrument, whatever that might be, there is an ACS for that. Yeah. There's still some PTSs for the CFIs, but they'll get changed, I'm sure, in the short term as well. But I would highly recommend that early on, really pre-solo, that you're looking at the ACS so that you understand what will I be expected to do as I'm working on slow flight for my check ride. If you practice that way, the check ride will be that much easier.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
I don't think I was held to knowing the ACS really well until I started working on my commercial. And I think that's where maybe instructors stop spoon feeding you a little bit. And they're like, Don't come back and do maneuvers with me until you understand and can articulate out loud what's required for this maneuver.
Right.
And I think maybe we should hold private students to those a little bit more. But if you want to be a great student, you can do it yourself. You don't need an instructor to tell you to do it. So that's two very important books. And I guess the last book really is two books as well, but they're normally printed together. It's the FAR AIM, the Federal Regulations, and then the Airman's Information Manual, I believe, or Airman Information
Aeronautical Information
Aeronautical
Manual.
Information
Yeah.
Manual. So one physical book, two different locations on the web if you look at the electronic copies, but almost an invaluable book that every, again, student at any level should be aware of and know how to use it.
Yeah, and that's the key, is knowing how to use it and learning. Let's just take the regulation side of things. There's for the type of training that we're talking about, there's two sections of the regulations that, for the most part, we're going to be very involved in. That's Part 61 and Part 91. And, just knowing the difference in the two. And
I sorry to interrupt you, but I remember when I was training, and my instructors would always say, this one's for certifications and this one's for what you have to do, right? And I was like, how do you remember all this stuff? It just blew my mind that they could remember this big regulation, but they only had to really keep up with two, maybe three if you talk 141, but
Right.
I'll let you go on now.
Right. But, Part 61 is the certification of pilots. If you want to know how many hours you must have to obtain a commercial pilot certificate, it's down in there in Part 61. If you want to know the oxygen requirements for a non-pressurized airplane, that's in Part 91. That's a flight rule. That's getting in the air. If you want to know right-of-way rules, fuel requirements, those are all flight things. So that's all in Part 91. And again, the regulations can be, to sit here and read the regulations is probably something you're not going to do, but being familiar with about where they are. Again, looking at the table of contents, if you really wanted to study the FARs, just studying the table of contents to know what is in there would be a great idea. In Checkrides, we do talk about oxygen requirements quite a bit, and I'll give maybe a private pilot candidate a scenario where they're much higher than they've ever thought about being. I say, okay, we want to fly at 15,500 feet, and the airplane may not even be able to obtain that, but I'll say, okay, let's say we're in an airplane that can get up that high. What are the oxygen requirements? And as long as they can look it up, because the Checkride is the oral portion is an open book test. So, from a time standpoint, if they have to look up every question that I ask them, we wouldn't have enough time to finish the Checkride. But that's one that a lot of times has the applicant digging in the FARs, and again, it's in Part 91, and as long as they can find it and answer the question, I'm happy with it.
The thing that I can remember using the FAR for was the regulatory stuff, was looking up the rules, like you said in 91, the operational components, right? I think as I worked on, am I ready for these check rides? I think I used 61 to look up, do I have all my stuff done? Do I have my nighttime done? Do I have my hood time done? Do I have all my things that I have to get done to make sure that I'm ready to go? Maybe auditing my logbook, but a very valuable tool. Probably not your weekend read. Probably not something you're going to sit around and enjoy, but something that if you're going to be a professional pilot, you're going to become intimately aware of what's in the FAR for sure.
Right.
Now, we've talked about the AIM a couple times. Still one that blows my mind, how good the book is, how valuable the book is, and just how much stuff is in it.
Yeah.
Not regulatory,
right,
but more suggestive. Would that be the way you would describe it?
Yeah, I would say definitely non-regulatory in nature. But I know I was a private pilot before I really dove into the AIM. When I distinctly remember one night reading it and thinking to myself, my gosh, there's a lot of good stuff in here. There really is. It's you can go back to the pilot's handbook. I'm going off on a tangent a little bit talking about other books, but Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge or the Airplane Flying Handbook. Boy, there's just so much good stuff in there, and the AIM is another good, and it's a little bit easier reading because we all joke that the FARs that's written by lawyers, and most of us don't have a law degree, so there's a lot of things that may be tough to understand. The AIM maybe written by pilots, I hope.
Well, I think the AIM's nice because it's got pictures in it, Wally.
Yeah,
so there's pictures in the AIM, and as you flip through, surprisingly, on a print version of the AIM, they're in color. I don't know how they afford to print these books and sell them for so cheap, but I can remember using the AIM a lot for the lighting systems,
right?
Because you can go in there and see a cool visual of it,
right?
And if I go somewhere and there's a lineman and they wave me in, and my wife or kids or whatever go, how do you know what that guy's saying? Well, I only know because I went and looked at the pictures in the AIM,
right?
The hand signals with the orange cones in their hand. That it shows you exactly what that lineman wants you to do.
Yeah.
And what does it mean if he holds up one finger and wants you to start an engine?
Yeah.
And you have two engines. Which one is that? The AIM answers those questions.
Right.
And I think everybody, as you become more proficient in your flying, you really should use the AIM more than we do. I think we all default to what you said, one of the other books, a JEP manual or something else, when a lot of that information is right there in the AIM.
And I would make a suggestion for a brand new student pilot, especially if you're a young person. Buy that first AIM in a printed version and keep it. And I say this because I distinctly remember cleaning out my office in my house many years ago, and I had my original FAR AIM, and I threw it away. And I still kick myself for throwing it away because I would love to go back and see what was in the FARs.
Two lighting systems?
In 1981.
Yeah.
I would just be curious to know. But I don't have that. I do have, as I mentioned earlier, I do have my original POH for that airplane.
The one thing I can assure everyone is that the regulatory section was much shorter in 1981 than it has become in 2021, for sure.
Right.
But the AIM is a really, really good book. And so how would we use these on a check ride? Well, again, I think we're talking about preparing. If you do all the flight maneuvers, and you know the ACS and you know what you're allowed to be, what the tolerances of those are, that's going to be helpful. I hear, and I was that person, do I have to do this maneuver starting into the wind? Or should I do this maneuver starting into the wind? If you have to do those type things, it's probably in the ACS.
Right.
If there's a specific rule, it's going to be in the ACS.
Right.
If it's a technique, then discuss that with your CFI.
Right.
But use the ACS as you're preparing. That means not 3 days before check ride, 3 months before check ride.
Yeah.
I think the POH is a great example of something that I think we all think about later on in our piloting training, right? Commercial, whatever. We start really reading and learning that stuff. But it would be very helpful, even again, pre-solo, to be thinking about those systems and be able to articulate what is this ignition system and magneto check that I'm doing and what's it really telling me.
Right.
That's going to make you a better pilot.
Yeah.
Not a better runner-upper, but a better pilot, right?
Right.
And then finally, the FAR and the AIM, two invaluable sources in one bound book that really should be in everybody's at least flight bag that they might not put in the plane with them, but what you travel to train with, you should have that.
Yeah.
Have electronic copies on your iPad, and then know the links to find them on the web if you want to look on the web.
Right. Absolutely.
Anything else to add? I know there's a lot more stuff to a check ride, and we're not saying if you just do these 3 things you're going to pass with flying colors, but these will definitely take the bumps out of a check ride for you and prepare you well.
Absolutely. And you just going back to the POH, circling back to that, the performance section, just be familiar with the charts and how to use them, obviously. But again, what's available? What charts are available? I inevitably will ask an applicant, okay, what true airspeed are you using on or cross country? And they'll give me a number, and I'll say, well, how'd you get that? Well, that's just what we use, is sometimes the answer I get. And I say, well, let's maybe explore the actual number and see what it is.
Before we start recording, you talked about one question you asked. I think the listeners love to hear from a designated pilot examiner on a question you might ask. It's a pretty basic one, but what's that one question that you ask about weight that everyone just should know how to go find that in the POH?
I asked the max takeoff weight of the airplane.
Pretty important freaking number.
It's important, yeah. And a lot of people, I think that ought to be on the tip of your tongue. You ought to be able to tell me it's 2,300 pounds. And we're at 2,280 today. We're 20 pounds below max takeoff weight. So, if someone shows up with a 50-pound bag, well, we're going to have to do something. Something's going to have to come off the airplane weight-wise.
Most would say the DP. We'll just leave them.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll leave them back somewhere else. So, again, it's more about knowing how to find the information, knowing how to use the books to your advantage, knowing how to be a competent pilot to use those tools. As always, thanks for listening to Behind the Prop, and stay behind the prop. Fly safe, everyone.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.